Hello and welcome. So far, we have been looking at issues relevant to a decolonial diaspora study in terms of visual culture and the culture industry. So remember, the culture industry refers to the products of processes of mass popular culture. And to this debate, I want to just introduce some further reflections. Firstly, in terms of the contribution made by decolonial diaspora studies writers within the culture industry, literatures, and those that have engaged specifically with the work of the Frankfurt School, the work of Adorno and Horkheimer in their book Dialectic of Enlightenment, for example. And here I'm referring to Ellis Cashmore, and specifically Ellis Cashmore's very poignant and significant realization, firstly, that the writing of Adorno and Horkheimer in Dialectic of Enlightenment can be understood as a refugee migrant narrative, in the sense that it can be seen to actually be very much inspired in terms of the reality of their experience, in terms of having to literally flee for their lives, one would expect, in terms of leaving Nazi Germany in 1933 and migrating to Columbia University, and there within writing about issues in terms of Western capitalism and the role of the culture industry in perpetuating, extending, enabling the endurance of Western capitalism. And Ellis Cashmore's contribution there is significant because there is this empathetic recognition of their status as refugee migrants and maybe the extent to which that has motivated their writing. But then there are critical reflections put forward by Ellis Cashmore. And these critical reflections relate to, firstly, what is seen as being a very sort of real pacifying construction of the consumer in relation to the culture industry. And moreover, and more specifically, an insufficient recognition by Adorno and Horkheimer that the notion of a mass level of industrial production of the same is actually quite outdated. While it might have some bearance in relation to Fordism in our current era of post-Fordism, informationalized knowledge economy, it seems that even the industry themselves would be very unlikely to actually describe their consumer market as a mass. And really what we're seeing is a demassification. And it's that focus on demassification that Ellis Cashmore then uses to actually develop this notion of a manufactured black culture industry, whereby Cashmore is identifying the need and relevance of Adorno and Horkheimer's Dialectic of Enlightenment to be applied to this manufactured, what he would describe as micro-market within the larger market of the culture industry. And in so doing, realizing its status as a micro-market actually then addresses what is a problem in Adorno and Horkheimer's work in terms of a massification of what is becoming increasingly demassified. But what is significant about Ellis Cashmore's contribution is that there is a recognition that capitalism is working in very specific ways to exploit features of race and racism and the existence of a racial hierarchy so as to actually gain profitability. So the main contribution therein of Ellis Cashmore is, for our purposes in relation to the Frankfurt School, is partly a recognition of the applicability of Adorno and Horkheimer's Dialectic of Enlightenment thesis, but more significantly, an emphasis on our need to actually recognize the more nuanced and quite specific ways in which capitalism is actually making profits the extent to which its logic of accumulation is very specifically operating in relation to exploiting the existence of a racial hierarchy in which the white population is positioned on top and everyone else is literally scrambling beneath in some various forms of colorism. With that in mind, I'd like to then think about the contribution of Black minority ethnic artists within the Black culture industry. Ellis Cashmore identifies the possibility of creative directors and artists emerging from the Black community, but says that we should caution against an essentialism that assumes just because they're Black, it's going to be liberatory. And what we should do is actually start to question what is Black culture and look at how Black culture is a social construct, such as white culture, and look at the social construction of Black culture and its articulation by these Black directors. And moreover, so in so doing, and moreover, Bell Hooks provides an interesting further dimension to that recognition, whereby Bell Hooks identifies problematics in relation to Black artists that seemingly just reproduce existing stereotypes in terms of the objectification of the Black female body in terms of a legacy of slavery in which the Black female body was almost constructed, to quote Bell Hooks, akin to animistic notions or notions of ownership in relation to the white male slave owner, and the necessity for mainstream white feminists to actually recognise a threefold oppression in terms of the construction of the male gaze as the subject position for the Black woman. Threefold in terms of race, in terms of class, in terms of gender. And so in the case study that I'm putting forward, it features photographic imagery taken by the artist Delphine Diallo. And it's an installation that is quite significantly distinct in its representation of Black women, some clothes, some without clothes. It features along the shop front of one of our most commercial spaces. So it's an acclaimed installation, and Delphine Diallo has done exceptionally well. But what I would like you to consider is, to what extent does it reproduce existing stereotypical assumptions in terms of the representation of the Black female? Or to what extent does it actually constitute, as Ellis Cashmore has identified, the possibilities of Black creatives to actually start to challenge the cultural power and representations that reproduce the racial hierarchy which has for so long and too long subjugated, discriminated, prejudiced, and refused to recognise the value of the contribution of Black artists. And I want you to think about this within the context of our current COVID-19 lockdown and the promise and delivery thus far that has been made by the government in terms of financing the cultural industries, to the tune so far of, in terms of the budget, of 1.57 billion. If it is a case that these Black creatives are actually very much involved in the mass production of Black culture in terms of a cultural industry, to what extent is there a real entitlement that there should be more support and financing for the black culture industry? Might it be a case that the black culture industry should be part and parcel of the wider industry's movement towards an entrepreneurial focus? Or might there be an argument in relation to, as Herbert Marcuse has identified so often, the high culture is actually providing this second dimension, this two-dimension, that provides for critical theory, critical engagement, and therein might that provide a logic for particularly ring-fencing black creatives as a significant area of culture to be supported and financed sufficiently to enable a continued production of this, one might argue, very important contribution to culture. Okay, thank you very much for your time.